Our next speaker is Gillian Crowther, who most of you will know quite well. And her lecture is Restoring Cellular Homeostasis, Therapeutic Strategies for Long COVID.
Thank you very much. Thank you so much, Rachel and Mark, for giving me the opportunity to speak. I'll be talking today about the key areas in which I find myself working. Obviously, I'm not a medical doctor, and so I'm not really pulled into the very complex cases we've heard this morning, like cardiovascular, pulmonary embolism, and so on. But because I work with the Academy of Nutritional Medicine, and I'm director of research there, where we do testing for infections and the mitochondria, I tend to, when I do see patients in those fields. And so what I'll be focusing on today is three key topics: iron dysregulation, which we did mention a little bit earlier, which I do feel is a factor really in all long COVID patients, but that's just my, involvement in the literature, let's put it that way so far, and my patient experience. And viral co-infections, herpes, enteroviruses particularly, and the hijacking of the mitochondria, for which there's a lot of literature backing. So COVID-19 is, as Sarah mentioned earlier, characterized by dysfunctional hemoglobin and hemoprotein and iron dysfunction. I've highlighted a few points in red in this particular quotation, but there are so many different articles, really good studies on iron dysregulation, and that's in both acute and long COVID. One reason may be that hepcidin, which is the master regulator of iron metabolism, has a remarkable similarity with the SARS-CoV-2 spike. And the hepcidin-like activity of SARS-CoV-2 can cause, or appears to be able to cause, significant iron dysregulation, together with hyperferritemia and ultimately ferroptosis, which is the worst form of reactive oxygen species, and may account for some of the inflammation that we're seeing. I've just added in this slide here, because this is such a fascinating article. It's the last of the four citations that I give there at the bottom, if anybody's interested. This gives a lot of the potential mechanisms and explains them in great detail. The hyperferritemia has been identified in over 400 scientific studies, and I've indeed been seeing that in patients, not quite as high as what Dr. Trefzer elucidated earlier, with over 2,000, I think, but definitely higher than you would expect. I mean, an ideal, according to the latest science, appears to be around about 80 max, really, and it doesn't seem as though the laboratory reference ranges have been adjusted to that yet, but that's quite a sort of long explanation to get there, but certainly higher than that in most cases. The other kinds of iron dysregulation that I've been seeing, and others as well, is low hemoglobin, for the reason just mentioned. Red cell distribution width as well, where the dysregulated iron is sort of packing in, and then the size has potentially something to do with the fact that there's so much iron in there. I mean, that's again a bit of a long explanation, but it does appear to be the case. And then ferritin, that was a question earlier, appears to be storing the unbound iron, and it's finding it very hard to get out again of the macrophages, in particular inside the mitochondria. There are various different interpretations of the iron panel. I won't want to sort of say always low or always high, but particularly useful appears to be ceruloplasmin, which is rarely measured actually, but when I do measure that, it's low, or very often low, and that's the carrier for copper. Without ceruloplasmin, you can't transport bioavailable copper, and copper is vital for exit from the macrophages that I've just mentioned that have the stored iron. And so this iron dysregulation appears to be partly linked to lack of that bioavailable copper, or at least lack of access to it. And retinol, unfortunately, a bit hard to measure sometimes, can be very expensive, but that is the backbone of ceruloplasmin. And so these, all play together. ESR as well, when it's low, according to the work of David Berg and others, can indicate hypercoagulation, but there are many other markers for that that have been discussed this morning. So for the iron dysregulation, I'll just take a quick sip of water. What I've found useful is, and I've given a lot of references below as to the reasoning for retinol being important. That's a fraction of vitamin A that, and it's not the beta carotene, though beta carotene is of course important as well. But if you would like more references, I have, a lot now because I've been focusing particularly on this topic. So retinol, interestingly, you can obtain in high levels from cod liver oil. Of course, you've got to be careful, and it's not going to be one size fits all for every patient, but the right kind of cod liver oil that does contain high levels of copper, and that needs some investigation. When I say copper, it's not the ordinary copper where we hear copper is toxic. It is this Cu1 bioavailable copper that you can't really just get in a supplement and swallow. If not that, then a bisglycinate chelate, there are a couple appear to be in the world that are sort of appropriate, or homeopathic copper. Dr. Klinghardt, for example, is using that in Seattle and has been finding that very, very helpful with his patients. Organic grass-fed beef liver as well, if it's got high levels of that particular copper in it. Whole food vitamin C, useful for the reasons I've mentioned here. I won't sort of go into them in great detail now, but a proteolytic that contains, for example, nattokinase or lumbrokinase can be helpful to help with the blood flow. If you've noticed hypercoagulation in your patient, again, not so much the area of us naturopaths, nutritional therapists. If it's serious, we're going to either co-refer or not even see those patients. But one has to make sure that they're not on a pharmaceutical blood thinner, of course, if you do go that direction. Also interesting about a proteolytic is that it can break down the spike protein. And if you've got a patient who's got long COVID, it's very likely, for reasons that we'll go on to in a moment, that they've still got the spike protein in their cells. It can last for up to 18 months, I think, has been found so far. So breaking that down with a proteolytic can be very helpful. And Dr. Trefzer, I think, mentioned a few earlier as well. Coriander, also cilantro, can be very helpful for helping to detox from heavy metals, but one shouldn't forget a binder either. This is quite useful. I know Sarah mentioned the various different clays you can take, either zeolite or diatomaceous earth or chlorella. And I like to do a good evaluation of the patient's overall vitamin and mineral status, for example, using BioLab's BIO1 micronutrient screen. So the viral co-infections are particularly prevalent because of this factor. I think I mentioned 18 months just now. I think the study shows 15 months that the S1 protein remains in cells for up to this period of time, and probably as time goes on, we'll find that it's longer. And it also functions as a viral reservoir. Brilliant article, this one, very worth reading. It uses the abbreviation PASC, which is post-acute sequelae of COVID-19. And this is an article, quite a recent one, I think it was June 2021, that found that 2/3 of patients in the study had a reactivation of their Epstein-Barr virus, 66.7%. And I've certainly seen high levels in my patients in these particular tests. Anything over 1 is positive. They're weak positive for a couple of the stimulation index, which is SI, And you can see here how very, very high it can go. Until COVID, we had never seen anything really above 300. And now it's sometimes going up to these incredibly high levels. Some patients, it's rare to have a patient who's measured their virus in question before COVID, and then you can measure it sort of during or after. This is one that we did have who had a level, I can barely see it on my own screen, I hope you can see it. I think it was 13 beforehand, and then it had gone up to almost 300 in the lytic form, which means currently replicating, multiplying. It's probably higher when we actually got to speak to the patient. And other viruses that can reactivate, shown in literature, are the enteroviruses. In other words, viruses that begin in the gut and can become systemic if left untreated. So that's Coxsackie, echovirus, and others. So what do I and others do for reactivated infections? Herpes, particularly Epstein-Barr cytomegalovirus, which we've just seen, and varicella zoster virus. Well, licorice has got some good literature behind it and is formed as a tincture that one can take. And Andrographis paniculata, also literature that I've sourced there at the bottom, and there's much more, a miraculous compound to restrain viral replication. And skullcap, also called Chinese skullcap. The extract is bakelin. That has noted antiviral properties, also against the enteroviruses. Dandelion, which has also been mentioned previously. I think it's particularly the leaves, and that blocks the interaction between ACE2 surface cell receptors and the SARS-CoV-2 spike protein. So that particularly in someone where you know it's very likely that they've not only got the reactivated infections, but the SARS-CoV-2 continuing to wreak havoc. And Artemisia annua, that is one where one has to be a little more careful, maybe not use that forever. Well, you wouldn't, but to pulse it, because of it can have a down-regulating effect on the mitochondria. So other herbal remedies, the black seed oil we discussed earlier, quercetin and zinc for the reasons already discussed, because quercetin acts as an ionophore if you're not using the other ones that have been mentioned so far. Curcumin, Cistus incarnus has got good literature behind it, and I have found patients really take to that well, not necessarily large numbers of cups every day, but you know, sometimes they'll begin on 1 tablespoon and increase it, but it's got demonstrated antiviral action, including against SARS-CoV-2. And L-lysine, the amino acid, if you put that into a Petri dish, it'll kill all the viruses in there, not necessarily in the gut and in the body, because you don't know how it's going to go through the various membranes, but that can be very helpful too. And then to support the natural killer cell activity that's so often very, very low, glutathione, liposomal, N-acetylcysteine, with the one proviso I mentioned earlier, which is that, and there's an article here I've linked to, it can release histamine and enzymatically modified rice bran as well. I've found to be helpful in some patients too. So the last section I'll go on to is the hijacked mitochondria. Good articles again that evidence that upon entry into the cells, viral RNA and proteins localize to the mitochondria and hijack the host cell's mitochondrial function to viral advantage, which is you know, a reason why you really have to look at the glycolysis going on in the patient and the hypoxia. It explains that as well, because you're losing the mitochondrial function. And so it appears to be able to directly manipulate mitochondrial function to evade host cell immunity and facilitate viral replication. Well, that makes sense from the point of view of the virus, doesn't it, to do that, but can have a horrifying effect on patients, where particularly that article on the left there mitochondrial dysfunction in pathogenesis of COVID-19, you can see how the various different actions, including upregulated reactive oxygen species, upregulated ferritin, the platelet dysfunction, the microbiota dysbiosis as well that we've just heard about so wonderfully from Professor Thomas, that can all contribute to hypocoagulopathy. So we do have some tests for mitochondrial function that we haven't yet had long enough in order to have the before and the after and the during, but we are collecting them. We have sort of vowed to collect them for as long as this very unfortunate period continues. Let's hope it doesn't go on for too long. But this is just the top page of a 13-page report that comes with the mitochondrial health index. And you can see in this patient who had had COVID, unfortunately long COVID for 6 months, she had non-mitochondrial respiration. I'll try and point that out. That's here, over 5 times higher than it should be. Her maximum oxygen consumption was far, far lower, less than 1/6 of what it should be. And even at rest, her oxygen, her energy production was glycolytic. So these tests will, I think, turn out to be very useful to show that kind of before and after if one finds that useful in one's patients. Just to mention that many mitochondrial proteins are copper dependent. It's astounding when you start looking into it. Again, that's this special form of copper. It's not the copper that's called toxic. In fact, if you see high levels of copper in a patient's serum, then often that's the unbound copper that actually is the kind of copper you don't want, but you want the bound copper that's doing its job, helping with the recirculation of iron. And interestingly as well, there's an antiviral signaling molecule on the mitochondria called MAVS, mitochondrial antiviral signaling, that is retinol dependent. And that actually is downregulated in SARS-CoV-2 as well. This article is in fact called COVID-19 Endogenous Retinoic Acid Theory and Retinoic Acid Depletion Syndrome. Really worth reading if you have time. So I do find that there's a sequence to this, and just as Sarah said, really, you can't put too much emphasis on the mitochondria until you've removed what needs to be removed and supported the other aspects, which I won't go into, like the gut at the moment, because we've heard a lot about that. But I do find, as you all do, the thyroid very important. I like to do a full thyroid panel quite early and check the iodine versus selenium. The bioavailable copper is also needed for thyroid hormone synthesis, and I've linked to that below. Magnesium, rate limiting mineral for complex 5 of the electron transport chain, quite apart from all the other 300 and more pathways that it supports. MCT oil, especially C8, interestingly, goes in at complex 3 of the mitochondria. And sometimes one does find, and Veach, a brilliant scientist who worked with Krebs in his laboratory and has only just passed away, he and others did find or have found that pyruvate dehydrogenase can be blocked at the start of the Krebs cycle. And you may find that you're not getting into the electron transport chain, the complex 1 activity that you would want. And that can be a reason for the block, in which case leapfrogging across that with C8. Explanation is there, that's reference to, and that's beta hydroxybutyrate. It's a precursor to that. That can be very, very helpful as well. Patients really notice the difference in their energy once taking that. B vitamins for methylation support, as we touched on earlier. Particularly pantherine, that's B5 to activate histone acetylation, and possibly vitamin E, especially the tocotrienols for its aid in respiratory infections. It can help to heal COVID lung damage. And of course, L-carnitine. There are many, many nutrients that support the mitochondria. One could have an endless list here, but I think like Dr. Trefzer mentioned earlier, one has to sort of select, and carnitine can really help again with the fat metabolism. The stage 2, a bit more sort of sophisticated, would be resveratrol to activate PGC1 alpha mitobiogenesis. That's the genesis, the development of new mitochondria if the mitochondria are suppressed in number. And R-alpha lipoic acid can be really magical, but what's the point of using these supplements, which are quite expensive, early if you've got the blockages of the different kinds? And luteolin we've discussed, or at least I think we heard a bit about that earlier, so I won't go into it now, particularly if patients have mast cell activation. So just a couple more slides. Give the mitochondria the nutrients they need. I've provided some books at the end which give a lot of information on that, so I won't go into that now. We've heard a lot about the importance of polyphenols, phytochemicals, and low carbohydrate diet, and the phosphatidylcholine, the membrane, nutrition that the membranes of the mitochondria need just as much as the membranes of the cell. You must curb EMFs, please, because, you'll again all know that really, but it's so hard to do, isn't it? And so hard to get our patients to do that because they disrupt cellular homeostasis so massively. And interestingly, and this isn't something I knew until quite recently, the voltage-gated calcium channels that we know the EMFs open up on the cells actually allow iron in as well. So that's a further overload of iron that your patients at this stage with COVID really don't need. And that's an article, interestingly, that's only recently come out, evidence for a connection between coronavirus disease and exposure to EMFs. But there aren't many of those out yet, let's put it that way. So photobiomodulation, in other words, red, infrared light, near and far, can very much aid mitochondrial reactivation. We'll probably hear more about this from Dr. Downing, who uses this in his clinic. And there are even intravenous photobiomodulation methods you can use. That one I have in the middle there, to which I have a link at the bottom, just costs $10 or £10, and that can also be very, very helpful. The book on the right, Red Light Therapy, gives information on how those initiatives can be used. Mitochondria do react, particularly complex 4, which is cytochrome C oxidase, react very, very well to particularly near infrared light. And here are some resources on the mitochondria, which are a particular passion of mine, the orchestrators of our cells, lots and lots to read there if one wants to dig into it. And so I hope that was useful. I just focused on those 3 areas, but they are what I see in my patients. So thank you so much.